probably still hear me. Very loud. There we go. All right, I didn't get to do this with the earlier crowd, so I'll do it with you guys. Out of the small crowd we have so far, who thinks they're the furthest traveled visitor to Fort Sumter? You, ma'am. Where are you visiting from?
We're not.
Seattle. Can anyone beat Seattle?
No.
Nope. That was a pretty quick one. So I think Seattle's got you. Too far north. Far enough north. Alaska? Yeah, Alaska would do it. I always try and find the Civil War connection to the furthest traveled place. I'll do it for all three. California, San Diego, actually was part of the United States at the time of the Civil War. It's one of the 33 stars up on that flag. Washington State was not, so it would come later. But it does have, it's right on the border with British Canada, and it's almost the flashpoint for a fight with British Canada, in which no one dies but a pig, right before the Civil War. Not kidding. James is giving me the go-ahead, so I'll wrap the tangent up. And Alaska is bought by William Seward, the Secretary of State, right after the Civil War. All right, well, welcome everybody to Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie National Historical Park. My name is Ranger Walt. We are happy to have you here. Both myself and Ranger James will be walking around the fort during the program. We'll be happy to point stuff out to you or answer any questions. I always start my program out with a question. And my question to you today is this. Can you think of a time when you, or someone you've loved or cared for, has been determined to accomplish a task? I see some nods. I see a raised hand. If anyone wants to share, you can. But you don't have to. I know it's often personal. My answers I have heard have included school and scouting projects. We always get big groups here. Helping a family member, serving your community or your country. I think we've got a pretty wide variety of reasons why we can be determined. And we're going to be talking about three different people today, who I think for very different reasons are going to be determined to either hold on to this fort for their side of choice in the Civil War, or in one case, to sail past this fort. We're going to be talking about why. We're going to be talking about ultimately what this resulted in. Our first person here today is a man named Major Robert Anderson. Major Robert Anderson, I think, is determined to hold on to Fort Sumter because of loyalty to the big U.S. flag you see flying above you today. Robert Anderson is assigned here to Charleston Harbor as a major at maybe the worst possible time to be a loyal U.S. Army officer right here in the harbor. He's assigned here in November of 1860, same month when we have maybe our most consequential presidential election in U.S. history. The man who's elected, Abraham Lincoln, is the only one of the major four candidates on the ballot who wants to stop the spread of slavery westward. And about a month and a half after he is elected, the state of South Carolina is going to gather delegates here in Charleston who will write down on a piece of paper that they are leaving the United States. We'll talk about their exact words in a little while. For Major Robert Anderson, the important part of this is that all of a sudden this U.S. flag has turned into a target on the backs of his just under 85 United States soldiers over at Fort Moultrie right across the harbor. He's going to look around and he's going to see back in Charleston that there are angry militia units, angry white citizens who are supporting the secession of South Carolina, who want that U.S. flag out of the harbor. He's also going to look around him and see that Fort Moultrie is very low to the ground, has pretty low-lying walls, low-lying islands. He's received a report from one of his officers that cows have been able to breach the walls of the fort in recent months. I think if cows can get in, then people can get in. So he decides he is not going to wait it out at Fort Moultrie. He's not going to take that chance. He is going to move his soldiers from Fort Moultrie to an island in the middle of Charleston Harbor with almost 50-foot high walls surrounded by water. Not going to be an easy place for those infantrymen to attack, even with small boats. Robert Anderson is moving his forces to Fort Sumter. On December 27, 1860, a U.S. flag a little like that, maybe one that was a little bigger, maybe one that was that size, is going to go up over Fort Sumter. Do you think the people back in Charleston, at least the people who have declared their secession, do you think they're happy to see that flag? No, they're still pretty angry. And over the next 3.5 months, we're going to have a standoff, whether or not the U.S. is going to continue to stay in Charleston Harbor. Negotiations will fail. When I say negotiations, keep in mind that they're basically at gunpoint. The South Carolinians are bringing in cannons, artillery, to aim at the lone U.S. position in the harbor. From James Island, Morris Island, Sullivan's Island, and a floating boat over this way. All aiming at this U.S. flag. Those negotiations will fail. Attempts to resupply the fort by the United States will fail. And on April 12, 1861, I think that just under 85 soldiers, a lot of them younger than me, would have seen probably the most fearsome sight of their young lives, which is one shot rising into the air over this harbor and exploding in midair. It's not going to hit a thing, but it is a signal shot, a signal for the other Confederate batteries to open fire on Fort Sumter, and a signal of 4 long and bloody years of war ahead. Over the next 34 hours, it's going to become very clear that Major Robert Anderson and his men are not going to be able to hold this fort. For one thing, the fort's on fire. The fire is broken out dangerously close to their gunpowder magazine. They've had to fight that fire to prevent an explosion. They are not able to do much damage at all to the Confederate positions shooting at them. And they're still just as low on food and other supplies as they were before the attack. So on April 14, 1861, loyalty is not going to be enough to keep this U.S. flag flying. It will be lowered over the fort. During the lowering, in a cannon accident, the first 2 deaths of the Civil War will occur. Private Daniel Howe and Private Edward Galway, killed ultimately by their own exploding cannon or powder battery. Those are the first 2 of over 700,000 deaths in the Civil War. Our second story is about a man named Alfred Rhett. Alfred Rhett is a Confederate colonel stationed here in the middle of the Civil War. But he's not just any Confederate colonel. He is closely linked to the reasons why we're here in the first place. He's from a wealthy white slave-owning family back in Charleston. It's a pretty powerful family. His brother runs a local newspaper, the Charleston Mercury, which had published descriptions of Major Anderson's defenses, like, hey, we don't know what's going to happen, but just in case the malicious want to know, here you go. He is the son of a former senator and politician, and his dad is going to sign that piece of paper that says that South Carolina is leaving the U.S. They will say that a geographical line has been drawn across the Union, and all the states north of that line have elected a man who in his opinions and purposes is hostile to slavery. Abraham Lincoln's hostile to slavery, we are leaving. 2.5 years later, Alfred Rhett is here, where it all began, at Fort Sumter. He's assigned to defend this fort. And he's going to be presiding over what I think are the 2 primary institutions that define the short life of the Confederate States of America. One of those is war. During Alfred Rhett's time at the fort, the United States is going to take Morris Island, a little bit south of us, and it's going to be able to start about a 1.5 year long bombardment of Fort Sumter. If anyone's standing right in front of me, you might be able to look behind me and see a circular object to the left of this cannon window in the wall. That is one of over 40,000 artillery projectiles that were launched into Fort Sumter by the U.S. and will ultimately mostly tear it down to rubble. We have recorded 52 Confederate deaths here during the late part of the Civil War. Alfred Rhett is also presiding over the system of slavery here at this fort. We have record of over 500 enslaved workers in just the year that he is here who were forced to work here. They're doing pretty dangerous jobs. They are rebuilding walls that are being actively torn down by that artillery fire. They're working in the Confederate powder magazine. Unlike these Confederate soldiers, they didn't choose to be here. They're forced to. We have record of six enslaved people being killed here at Fort Sumter later in the war. And an eyewitness who was enslaved here says that it was pretty dangerous. Could have been more. Ultimately, I think Alfred Rhett is very determined to hang on to Fort Sumter for the Confederacy. For independence, for a few, not for too many. Our third person here today is a man named Robert Smalls. Unlike our first two subjects here, Robert Smalls was not a soldier at the beginning of the Civil War. Instead, he is enslaved. He's been enslaved for his entire life up to this point. He's enslaved on a Confederate ship called the CSS Planter. It sails through Charleston Harbor, delivering goods to the different Confederate forts. And Robert Smalls is pretty good at his job. He knows how to avoid the dangerous shoals and sandbars that make it tricky to navigate this harbor. But he's also pretty observant. He knows that the Confederates have a rule aboard their ship. They are not allowed to leave the ship alone to the enslaved workers aboard. There has to be at least one Confederate officer aboard, or a Confederate officer or enlisted man aboard at all times. But he also knows the city of Charleston has some temptations. It has dining and drinking establishments. It has some of their family members. I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to pick on either of you two in the front row. Have you ever known someone who skipped their homework? Maybe? I bet. Well, the Confederates, one night in May 1862, skipped their homework. Robert Smalls is going to look around and he is going to see his opportunity. But the only people left aboard this ship are he, his enslaved crewmen, and some of his family members. We'll pick up more on the way. He is going to take that opportunity and he is going to try and sail the Planter through Charleston Harbor and make it to the U.S. vessels blockading this coastline. If he can do that, he and his men and his family can take shelter as free people behind United States lines. In order to do that, he's going to have to sail right past Fort Sumter. It's a Confederate-held fort at this point, trying to prevent any unwanted ships from entering or leaving. In order to do that, he's going to have to trick them. He'll have his men raise the correct flag and hand signals. He'll dress some of them in Confederate clothing. It's pretty dark out, so they can't see their faces very well. And there are some close calls, but he's going to make it by. So I think it's pretty obvious why Robert Smalls is determined to sail past this fort. This is the literal difference between his former life of slavery and the potential for freedom. He'll spend the rest of the war exercising that freedom. He'll go up and down the Atlantic coastline. He'll recruit African-American soldiers to serve in the U.S. Army in this war. He'll meet the Secretary of War. He'll participate as a member of the armed forces in the attacks on Charleston Harbor. And he'll be back at the end of the war. On April 14, 1865, 4 years to the day after this flag was lowered, it is now going back up the flagpole. The exact same flag, the exact same fabric. Two of these three men are back. Major Robert Anderson is back, I think, to celebrate the biggest continuity of this war. And with this same flag going up, you're trying to send a message, right? That this is still the same country it was before the Civil War. It's not split in half. It's not 33 little countries. It's one country. But Robert Smalls is also here. And I think he's here celebrating the biggest change of this war. He's bringing the same ship, now the USS Planter, through Charleston Harbor. And on it are some of the thousands of people from downtown Charleston who for the last 2 months have been celebrating their freedom for the first time in their lives. And now, maybe for the first time in their lives, they're getting to see a U.S. flag raising that they can celebrate, that they'll gain a citizenship of shortly. I want you to think about what these people's determination resulted in. Over 700,000 deaths, but over 4 million freed from slavery. It's not going to mean that every piece of prejudice or segregation is going to go away overnight, but it's a huge step. Those deaths are going to have a huge impact on the country. And I want you to think about what your determination might mean for someone else. Whatever you thought about might have meant for other people. And I would like to thank you for attending our program today and for indulging me here for 15 minutes or so. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your time here at Fort Sumter, and I would encourage you to ask either Ranger James or myself or our volunteer Jeff if you have anything you would like to know about. Please do find us. We're happy to help you. Hope you have a wonderful day, and thank you so much.